Hello and welcome back to Hudson Auto Films. Today we are continuing to work on this thing, the 4x4 supercar. If you haven't seen the last few episodes, we are embarking on combining this wrecked 2007 Aston Martin Vantage and this Landrover Discovery. So far we've taken the Landrover from a fully functional, albeit very rusty car, all the way down to its chassis. We chopped the whole body off and then it was time to strip the Aston down. So we completely stripped that down, and then in the last episode I managed to drag the Aston body onto the Land Rover for the first time. So if you haven't seen those episodes, please do check them out. They are really good fun. In today's episode we are going to work on getting the Land Rover to sit where it's actually meant to sit. Right now it is sitting far too high. We need to drop it about 5 inches so the Aston sill marries up to those body mounts on the side. And what is currently standing in our way is a few portions on the Aston body clashing with the Land Rover chassis. So today we need to get our angle grinder out again and start removing sections of the Aston body. This is the primary portion that is disrupting the Aston body sitting where it needs to sit. So we need to cut out an area here on both sides, allowing the Aston body to sit down and that portion of the chassis to sit inside the body. For those of you who haven't seen the previous episodes and you're wondering why we are working such a rusty chassis, the chassis will be fully restored. However, whilst we're doing all this cutting and making things fit, it seems sensible to leave it as it is. And once we've done everything we need to do, we'll whip the body off and restore the chassis. I'm going to start off by marking as best as I can where I think roughly we need to cut. Rather than cutting out a huge amount, I'm going to try and go for the bare minimum initially. Inevitably, we'll have to cut out more and we'll have to clean everything up. But this is just the initial bit to try and get things sitting right. Time to get cutting. Okay, so we've cut those portions out either side and they're pretty much perfectly even. I do need to do some tidying up and making them just so they are identical. Before we even think about cleaning things up, we need to lower the car down and see if we've given the chassis the clearance it needs. Okay, so that was successful. We have managed to reduce the ride height by about 1.5 inches, but we've still got roughly another 4 inches to go. So I'll show you now where things are clashing, things we need to remove, things we need to cut, and then we'll keep on going. As you can see, we're a lot lower in every respect, but if I take you in here, you can see now the top is just hitting there. Now we are low, we can see what else is going to hit. And basically this portion of the floor is going to get funny with this. This is all very thin and I'm not too concerned about it. This is going to be our major mounting point for the body, and if you look in here, if I can pull that out, you can see just how thick that is. So we don't want to interfere at all with this sill section. However, the floor I'm not too concerned about. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to cut a straight line from here to around here, come out there, and then hopefully we'll have clearance for this. On the inside, when it comes to this bad boy, this is resting on quite a major brace that goes across. So I'm going to, again, make life easier. I'm going to cut straight up here, go along here, and then see basically how much we have to remove of it in order for this to all sit lower. Okay, so that is one side cut. Initially, I was just trying to cut through this rail here, which was incredibly thick. But in the end, it was easier to cut further up here, around it, and back round, and then it was able to snap off. But now it's time to do exactly the same to the other side. So let's do it. Well, there we go. That was a lot easier than the other side, as I kind of had the method knowing I'm cutting around there and I can push it down, but we got there. A few of you have made the point in previous episodes, why don't I use a reciprocating saw? And right now it's just due to power. I'm powered by a little generator and it doesn't allow the saw to basically run fast enough. Even the angle grinder is running at about 50% of what it should be, but that is enough to do what I need to do, even if it's not the easiest way of doing things. But now I think it's time we lower this down and we see how it sits. Obviously, due to removing all that material, it will sit lower, which means a lot of the other things we talked about earlier that are probably going to hit will start hitting. So we'll deal with those next, but let's see how it sits. The gear stick is now hitting, so I need to cut a little hole to allow that to come through. Temporary gear stick hole done. Now let's see what hits next. Okay, so as you can see, we are sitting rather on the piss. The good news is the back is sitting roughly where we want it to sit, and the cutting we did is just about perfect. Everything fits where it should do, and that's really good. But you can see it is this side which is causing the problem. So let me show you what it is. So if I take you deep underneath here, you can probably just about see. The issue we are having is with the transfer box. Right now it is hitting on this corner of it. But clearly as we go further down, we are next going to hit there. We are also going to hit back here. And obviously that is a moving part. So the cutting continues. I think we are going to have to cut a portion out around here to here-ish. Luckily this is just thin stuff. This is not particularly hard to cut through. Now we just need to cut out a tiny bit on this side, but it's much smaller. It's just the edge of the gearbox is slightly catching. Right, so lots of cutting later. We have all the clearance we need on this side. After we did the cutting on the other side, we were able to get the car pretty low. However, we couldn't get it kind of where we needed it to be that way on the chassis. And it's because it was hitting areas in the gearbox, like the back of the gearbox there. You can see where it's a bit shinier, which is where the body is rubbed on it. Here, and then a bit lower down, that bad boy. So it's obviously very messy right now, which isn't helped by the soundproofing, which is kind of going everywhere. But as I've mentioned a billion times, we'll clean everything up later. We're just going for clearance right now. So hole check. That one, that one, that one, and that one. So let's lower it down yet again and see where we are. Okay, so after a lot more faffing, the rear is sitting roughly where we want it to. It's kind of hard to gauge because obviously the front is now way too high and we're missing half the body panel this side, so that side looks way higher than it is, but that is more or less where we want it to be. So We've come down a huge amount, if you remember where we started. I had hoped we could get down to this body mount, but I think realistically it's going to be too tricky to close that kind of final 1.5 inches, which doesn't matter too much. As you can see, we've got a rail there. I mean, we could cut more from that rail and lower it further, but we'll see. We'll make that decision once we've cut the front down, as we'll be able to get a much better idea of kind of the overall ride height of the vehicle. You can really get a gauge at how high the front is now in comparison to the back. So the next stage is to start cutting out of this area. As you can see, it's not even sitting on the mount on this side, because the other mount on the other side still has a little bit of the bush on it. So the other side is sitting higher. I think basically what we're going to do is we're going to cut a straight line probably around here, cut it back there, and then we'll be able to go past this mounting point. We might be able to do something later down the line where this mount comes up and locks in kind of on an angle, but we'll see. Right now we're just sorting out clearance. Right, let's see how this sits. I don't know why it's not going down. The gear stick's stuck. Got a bit lowered, but now it's hitting the transfer box again, so I need to remove a little bit more, and then hopefully we'll sit better. Well, we are sitting a lot better than we were, and yeah, for the first time you can kind of envision this thing, and it's ludicrous. But as you can see, the back end is still a lot lower than the front end, and there is still a tilting issue going on, and basically we've run into our biggest issue yet. I removed everything that was causing any small clearance issues, and that's fine, but let me show you what is disrupting this from sitting exactly where it needs to sit. If you join me on the inside, you can see this rail going across. Basically, this rail is actually quite thin. You can hear it in the difference between the thickness of this, for example. That is the solid stuff. This is the thin stuff. But this portion basically covers up this rail we've got just there. We cut a little bit out of it at the back, as you can see when we're making clearance there. But essentially, it is interfering here at the front. So yes, we could just cut a portion off here and cut out more there, and it would be fine. However, that would just get us to the height we need. The issue is kind of hard to see, but you might just be able to see that this side is actually sitting considerably higher by about 1.5 inches. And that is because on the passenger side, you can see we clear the Landrover chassis rail just, but then on the driver's side, you can see we are just overlapping. So it's really frustrating, as it about 1 centimetre difference would mean the Landrover chassis rails would sit up between the Aston rails. But because of where they're placed, it's causing the car to constantly sit on a tilt. And I've tried balancing them, but there's just not enough surface area for it to sit. So as you can see in there, that is the rail, and it takes up about half of this large raised portion. And you can also see how it's slotting over the chassis. And you can also see how the corner of the raised portion is sitting on the chassis on this side. And then on the driver's side, you can see the rail is sitting on the chassis on this side, and the raised portion is about 1 inch over the chassis rail. So you can really see how close it is, and it's really frustrating, as I mentioned. If things were even less than 1 centimetre different, the whole thing would slot over. But even if that was the case, we'd still probably have issues at the front. So I'm thinking we're going to have to cut out a long, narrow portion of the floor. If we basically cut out this whole portion here, including the rail underneath, with about 1 inch either side of this larger raised bit, we would no longer have any interference issues with the chassis. And then at the front, if we just square this off, the car then would basically have no interference, and then it could sit down properly on our outriggers and body mounts. But what are the drawbacks of this approach? Well, one is strength. Obviously, you're then removing a good portion of the floor and a rail. With that said, it is not a crucial rail in the same way that these are. As you can see, the outer portion and these sill structures are just unbelievably vast. And it all goes up through here. This is all incredibly thick metal that carries the whole car around and creates this kind of square frame around it. And if you look at the density of these, that makes me think we're going to be okay. I definitely not want to touch any of those portions, and that kind of is our main frame. As we'll be retaining the main strength of the car, plus gaining the Landrover strength, I think removing those portions of the floor and those kind of lighter rails won't be too bad. Another issue to consider is mounting the seats. Obviously, that would make these seat mounts basically redundant. They would lose all their rigidity and not be safe. But at the end of the day, creating new seat mounts isn't the end of the world. We have so many portions of the car, both Aston and Landrover, that are incredibly rigid. It is just a little bit more fabrication. I can't get over how ridiculous this thing is. It's a little bit hard to tell at the moment, but I think the whole body needs to go back a couple of inches. The front wheel clearly is a little bit out, but the back one feels fine. But it's a little bit hard to tell these things without more body panels. Well, let's get cutting this floor. Well, there we have it, a much lower 4x4 Aston Martin. It's easy to forget where we started at the beginning of this episode, but the car has literally come down about 6 inches across the whole thing, and we've taken it from a ridiculous looking monster truck to a ridiculous looking something. Without a doubt, I definitely removed a little bit more Aston than I initially thought I would, but that is to be expected, as if you couldn't already tell, these two cars were never really meant to be bound together. Though we've removed more than I initially thought we would and had hoped we would, I'm not particularly concerned. Everything we removed has been relatively lightweight on the structural side, and we haven't had to touch any of the main structure which kind of surrounds the whole car. So I feel very comfortable that the car is still very rigid. Obviously, you wouldn't want to drive it as an Aston Martin in this form. However, once this is mounted to the Land Rover chassis, any rigidity that we had lost from cutting bits out will be regained by mounting it to the very rigid ladder chassis. This process has been rather labour intensive, and it's been quite an intense day or so doing it, so it's safe to say that I definitely haven't been completely on the ball, as my goal was to get the Aston sill sitting on both of the Land Rover body mounts. However, after doing the last bit of cutting we did on the front, I was disappointed to find that we are still about 2 inches away from the front mounts, whereas we're sitting on the rear mounts. And this is where the sleep deprivation comes in. I didn't notice that the front mounts were about 2 inches lower than the rear mounts. So we're sitting exactly where we want to be, and the Aston body is level both this way and that way on the Landrover chassis, which is really good. So all the cutting that I've done in this episode will need tidying up. The reason I haven't done that in this episode is, without a doubt, we're going to have to do some final trimming to get the end result of perfect fitment. Perfect fitment does sound a little bit of a funny term when it comes to this thing. But right now we can't really do any final trimming until we have more body panels on. And the reason that is due to the placement of this body on the Land Rover chassis has no real impact mechanically. As long as we can get the variety of things from the engine bay into the cabin, like the steering, pedals, etc., cables, that is all that really matters. The rest of the placement of the body is purely visual. And obviously, without body panels, it's a little bit hard to determine exactly where things should be. A good example of this is the front wheel. As you can see, it's not sitting perfectly centered in the Aston arch, but we also don't have the front bumper, which completes the arch. And obviously on the back, we're missing the rear quarter completely. And on that side, our rear quarter is missing the bumper. So it's really hard to determine where things need to be until we have more body panels. The one thing I'm pretty adamant on is I want the rear wheel to sit basically dead center in the rear arch. So there's not much we can do until we at least have a rear arch. But that is some excitement for the next episode. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have making it. And I really hope you're enjoying this series. I have to say I'm having an absolute blast. It's just ridiculous, and that is really fun for me. So if you enjoyed this episode, and even if you didn't, please like, share, subscribe. It really does help me out. It allows me to keep making things like this and posting regular episodes. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please do subscribe to my Patreon, which is linked below. I post bonus content there, and generally it gets updates on projects like this a few weeks before it comes to YouTube. But regardless, I'm just happy you're here. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.